what does it mean to be an American? Well, depends on who you ask, right? But what we can say is that the American experience for white people is very different than the American experience for black people and people of color. And we're not talking about laws of averages here. We're not saying that for the average white person, life was very different than life for the average black person. We don't really need to get to that level of depth because all you really have to do is to look at the Jim Crow laws of the various southern and non-southern states in the United States in the 20th century. And the fact that you have two sets of laws, two societies, and really two worlds for individuals based upon race is nothing new. The same system exists in the 1860s, in the 1760s, in the 1660s, all the way back to the time that the first slaves are brought to the American colonies in 1619. Slavery, Jim Crow, and white supremacy are not problems that are exclusive to the American South, but they begin in the American South, in the case of Virginia and South Carolina. Now, in the Civil War, you might remember that we fixed the problem of slavery, but we see the emergence of sharecropping, which kind of looks very similar to slavery in a variety of different ways, and almost as soon as Union troops leave. In fact, while Union troops are still in the southern states, you see the adoption of black codes and Jim Crow laws, and eventually the Supreme Court of the United States gives legal sanction, legal blessing to those laws in the Plessy versus Ferguson court case, which says that segregation, even segregation that is mandated by state governments, is legal as long as it's equal. The idea is that it's okay to separate races as long as that separation is somehow equal. Separate but equal was a phrase that wasn't written by George Orwell or Franz Kafka or any other writer that delights in coming up with phrases that are so contradictory that they're almost funny. No, separate but equal was the law of the land. It was given legal sanction by the United States Supreme Court, and it's codified into law in almost every southern state legislature throughout the country. So once again, we see that the problem of slavery and Jim Crow originates in the South. How do you fix it in the South? Well, some leaders have tried. There's a civil rights movement that kicks off a little bit during the presidency of FDR. And remember that FDR realizes that if he goes too far on the issue of civil rights, then basically that is the equivalent of pushing the Democratic Party's self-destruct button, that the white Southerners that form the diehard core of the Democratic Party will begin bolting, if that's the case. And John F. Kennedy, remember, goes on a moral crusade, calls the civil rights, or the idea of civil rights, a moral crusade in 1963. And that crusade doesn't make it out of committee in the House of Representatives. The proposed civil rights bill of 1963 dies stillborn. Rhetorically, both FDR and JFK were exceptional at basically creating visions with words. They were exceptional in terms of how they describe civil rights, which they do in almost poetic terms. Like, that was what they were good at, but words are only as useful, to the extent to which they convince people. And unfortunately, both FDR and JFK fail when they try to convince really the biggest source of obstruction in the whole question of civil rights, and that is, of course, Southern Democrats. And it doesn't help matters that FDR is a New Yorker, JFK is from Massachusetts, and fundamentally, they don't understand the South. They're not born in the South. Their travels in the South have been very limited, and so they don't really get the obstruction that Southern Democratic politicians used to delay the passage of civil rights or a civil rights bill that might eliminate Jim Crow laws altogether. What becomes clear is that to fix this Southern problem, it's going to take a Southerner. And of course, there's some poetry in that, right? That it's not going to be a solution that comes from outside the South, that this Southern problem has to be fixed in the South. And it's going to take two Southerners from very different backgrounds, who have very different experiences, but I am convinced are probably the two most important American leaders after the Second World War: Lyndon Baines Johnson and Martin Luther King. If civil rights is a crusade, as JFK said that it was, then Lyndon Baines Johnson, pictured here, JFK's vice president, makes a very unlikely crusader. Lyndon Baines Johnson, and I'll just be abbreviating his name as LBJ, was a Southerner. Like Kennedy, he was a Democrat. And he was born into a, kind of a middle-class family in the Texas Hill Country. Now, sort of what sets him apart from JFK is that JFK is very young and, relatively inexperienced, but JFK is this sort of seen as this young, visionary, idealistic politician, right? A politician who represents the wave of the future. And in many respects, especially in terms of embodying the medium of television, he really is kind of this transformative leader. In a lot of respects, though, Johnson is the opposite of all of those things. Johnson is highly experienced. He's not so good at creating or, at the sort of transformative, at the whole transformative vision thing. He's not necessarily as good at giving a speech as Kennedy is. And let's just be honest, Johnson is a terrible person. In some respects, Johnson was kind of a terrible person in the same way that JFK was a terrible person. Both were serial philanderers. Neither, I think, would get husband or father of the year. But JFK, at least, was mostly not a bully. Johnson most definitely was. And the way that you can kind of say this is that Johnson, when he took public office, let's say, became very, very good at what we would kind of call backslapping politics. If there's one person in American or maybe even world history who I could describe as a political machine, it is Johnson. The guy was kind of a natural at it. He had this quote that I'm going to butcher, that goes something like this. I'm going to try my best Lyndon Baines Johnson impression. If you walk into a room and you don't know who's for and against you, you've got no place in politics. He had the ability to walk into a room and just kind of instinctively figure out who was on his side and who wasn't. And partially this is because Johnson had almost like this Holmesian ability to notice detail and to make deductions based upon those small details. But in other respects, he was just somebody who had great gut instincts for politics. And speaking of those gut instincts, for him, politics wasn't just about giving a speech on the radio or a speech in front of television cameras. Johnson was really in his element in the halls of power when it came time to working with people one-on-one or in groups to get them to do what he wanted them to do. And again, Johnson was a bully. If you don't believe me, this is a photograph of somebody getting the Johnson treatment. And just look at how amazing this is, and terrifying, by the way, because if Johnson wanted something from you, you would know it immediately. And the way he would get it from you is he would charm you. He would get into your space. He wowould use his full height. And I mean, just look at this guy. He really is kind of an imposing person. He would put his, basically he'd bring his full size to bear and cower you. like I think I said, charm you, flatter you, get into your space. He would threaten you. He would try to bribe you. Again, all the hallmarks of a bully. So what you're probably thinking is that Mr. Dry just said, LBJ is awesome because LBJ is a bully. Not exactly. But here's what I am saying. In the history of civil rights, we've already talked about President Nice Guy, the president who is great at talking about civil rights, but when it comes down to it, is afraid to go too far. And arguably, and this may be a little unfair, but President Lincoln is President Nice Guy. President Lincoln does support the adoption of the 13th Amendment, but remember that he's not an abolitionist. He doesn't go too far in that direction. FDR and JFK, we've already talked about the fact that they can talk a tough game when it comes to civil rights, but when it comes down to performance, they can't really get that much past. And even if you're looking at FDR's accomplishments in the realm of civil rights, that comes about through executive orders, not through legislation. Unfortunately, maybe what U.S. history tells us is that you don't really need President Nice Guy. Maybe what you need to force Southern politicians to give way and embrace civil rights, maybe you need a bully to fight other bullies. Maybe you need Lyndon Baines Johnson. Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy were both great at the inspiration business in politics. They were great at inspiring people, and in King's case, King was exceptional at leading a mass movement. That is not what Johnson is good at. Johnson is really good at one very specific thing, and that is the science of legislation. There is no president in American history before Johnson or since Johnson who knows more about the business of passing legislation. And that's partially because actually Johnson is almost as significant of a figure in American legislative history as he is in presidential history. Johnson's political career begins in Texas, first as a congressman, and later on he becomes a senator. And while he's in the Senate, two very important things happen. The first is that Johnson is kind of seen as FDR's great sidekick, I guess, in the Senate. He's seen as almost FDR's heir in some respects in the Senate, somebody who really supports the New Deal, and it, again, also helps FDR that Johnson himself is from the South. And so Johnson's support coming from the southern state is very important to FDR. But there's another thing that's even more important, and that is that before Johnson, the Senate is kind of the way that it is today, in the sense that we think of the Senate as this institution that is very obstructionist. It's very inefficient, and arguably that's the way it's intended to be. It's intended to kind of be the place where legislation goes to die. It's supposed to be more cautious until Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes the majority leader of the Democratic Party. And slowly but surely, Johnson makes it a point to reach out and get to know basically everybody else in the Senate chamber. And he basically makes the Senate his instrument. We're going to talk about the Civil Rights Bill of 1957, really the first piece of civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. And not ominously enough, but it's kind of a bit of foreshadowing, because that comes because of Johnson's ability to pass legislation. And I mean, not only would he always know who the swing votes were, not only did he know exactly how to bribe or cajole or threaten or flatter other politicians to vote the way he wanted, but even the way in which he would take votes in the Senate was calculated to get the result that he wanted. So, for example, if the Senate was voting on an issue and opponents of a bill were let's say, on the other side of town, and Johnson wanted to get the vote in quickly, what he would do, and Robert Caro, who's Johnson's biographer, describes this in great detail, is that, like a great conductor, he would go through the roll call of the Senate, getting the ayes and nays. And if Johnson really wanted to make sure that the vote was finalized before the bill's opponents arrived, he would do this big sort of sweeping motion so that the roll would be called faster and faster. But if Johnson was still working on people, trying to get those last votes, he would make sure that the votes were calculated at a very gentle pace. So this is somebody who makes the U.S. Senate, a body that is supposed to be obstructionist, into this, machine of almost perfect efficiency. And so that is what Johnson brings to the presidency when Kennedy is assassinated. Now, Johnson's relationship with President John F. Kennedy was ambivalent at best and downright hostile at worst. They didn't really get along. And just for some photographic evidence of this, take a look at this meeting between Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas and the new freshman senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. This is actually President Kennedy, Johnson's future boss, getting the Johnson treatment. Johnson's getting up in his face. And from Johnson's perspective, Johnson really doesn't respect Kennedy very much. To him, Kennedy is inexperienced. This was kind of the same argument that Richard Nixon used, right? But to him, Kennedy was just simply using his Senate seat as a springboard for the presidency. And Johnson resented that. To Johnson, it seemed like Kennedy just didn't know anything about the Senate and its rules and protocols. And so, if anything, when Johnson and Kennedy both try to get the Democratic Party's nomination, really in terms of experience, it should be Johnson that gets it. But politics is beginning to change. The television becomes more and more important. Americans want a younger president that kind of represents them. And to be honest, Johnson kind of represents the Southern Democratic Party of the New Deal. So Kennedy gets Johnson so that basically he can secure the swing state of Texas, which, by the way, ends up being very good for Kennedy since that election was extremely close. But whenever Kennedy wins, a lot of people within the Kennedy administration try to sideline Johnson. In fact, Johnson himself is kind of goofy. I think that's probably putting it diplomatically. And so a lot of Kennedy's people called him, quote, Uncle Cornpone. So again, like most vice presidents, he was sidelined, but Johnson is the rare example of a vice president who is actually phenomenally good at something. And so he kind of has that Teddy Roosevelt experience where he has tons of energy and tons of ambition, but doesn't really know how to realize any of it as vice president. So as almost all of you know, though, in 1963, tragedy strikes when President John F. Kennedy is assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. And so as people start recovering from the shock of that loss, the question starts being asked, what does a Johnson presidency look like? What is Johnson going to try to accomplish? We've already seen how Johnson, in some respects, can abuse his power and office just kind of naturally by just being himself. What happens when this person becomes president of the United States? Well, one quote that probably most of you have heard of is that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. This was the old saying of Baron Acton. Robert Caro, in his biography of Johnson, has a very different argument, and it's an argument that I find compelling, that power can corrupt, but maybe not. That power doesn't so much corrupt character, power is revealing of character. it basically allows people to do the things that they've always wanted to do in the first place. So if you're a corrupt person and you decide to get into politics for reasons of personal enrichment, then that's going to reveal itself if you are basically given a position of power where you don't have to pretend anymore. But in Johnson's case, we see something very, very different. We see that Johnson's character is revealed a little bit. It doesn't make him a saint, by the way, but we might have to actually go and explore a little bit of Johnson's background to understand what he's about to do. Because Johnson is not only going to try to advance civil rights, he's also going to advance the New Deal, extend the New Deal for a new generation. And this is because Johnson was actually born into a very impoverished region of Texas. Again, the Texas Hill Country. And this is coming on the heels of works being published on poverty in the United States, particularly poverty in rural areas that were left behind by the recession. In fact, the reason Johnson becomes a powerful politician in the first place and attracts the loyalty that he does in Texas is that Johnson promises his constituents that if he is elected, he will bring electricity to Texas, or at least his part of Texas. And he makes good on that promise. And that basically changes life at a very fundamental level. No longer do people in Johnson's constituency have to go to a water well located hundreds of yards away from a house and bring it back to a house. And basically what that does, by the way, is that if you do that enough times, you basically, hang, move those buckets of water by sort of hanging them over your back. A lot of women in that area were constantly stooped over because that's what life is like without electricity and running water. And Johnson brought that to his area of Texas. And so he's very aware of, what poverty looks like. But he also knows a thing or two about racial discrimination. Johnson actually spends a fair amount of his early career before he goes into politics as a school teacher. And apparently what happens is that he gets a job in a poor school for mostly children of Latino Americans. And most of these kids could not speak English. And apparently these were kids that were basically just ignored and nobody cared about. Nobody cared to teach these kids. They were kind of written off. But apparently Johnson cared. In fact, he cared so much that not only did he teach the kids to learn English, but he also taught the school janitor as well. He took that job very, very seriously, just like he does everything else in his life. And what that forces him to do at an early age is it forces him to confront white supremacy and how many people of color, not just Black Americans, but people of different races are left behind. So Johnson sees that firsthand, and then he's elected to office, and he has to do business on a daily basis with many of the same individuals who are architects and supporters of that system, again, in Congress and in the Senate. So that's what Johnson brings to the table. And after Johnson becomes president, he pitches what is known as the Great Society. And again, the Great Society can best be understood as an extension of the New Deal, and it's a pretty significant extension. For one, this is really the first time in American history where the government successfully involves itself in healthcare, creating a system called Medicare, which is done at the federal level, and Medicaid, which is funded at the state level. The Great Society also increases Social Security benefits, provides billions of dollars in federal money to schools, particularly low-income schools. This is, by the way, if you've heard of, schools that provide free lunches or subsidized lunches, this is where that comes in. Again, it's one of those things where if you look around closely enough, you can see traces of the Great Society today, especially with Medicare and Medicaid, but also beyond those programs as well. So we see a bigger welfare state, and we also see, kind of along with that, Johnson's war on poverty. This is a campaign to eliminate that very deep poverty in mostly rural areas of the United States. The Great Society also advanced immigration reform in 1965. In 1965, you have an Immigration Act that's passed, which eliminates those quota systems that we talked about in the 1920s, where really, if you wanted to immigrate to the United States, your success or likelihood of success depended upon where you were from. If you were from Great Britain or Germany or Western European countries, basically you had a much higher likelihood, an exponentially likely, higher likelihood of immigrating versus, let's say, immigrants from Russia or really non-European areas of the world. Johnson abolishes those quota systems and instead replaces it with a lottery system where all immigrants are basically coming in on the same footing and have an equal chance of getting, of successfully immigrating to the United States. So we'll get to point 5 in just a second. But if you look at points 1 through 4, again, you're calling for a major expansion of programs that are similar to the New Deal. Again, Social Security through Medicare and Medicaid is increased. The welfare state is actually expanding after the Second World War instead of shrinking during the Johnson administration. And we talked about the fact that there is a bipartisan consensus to keep the New Deal. The question is there a bipartisan consensus to expand the New Deal? And this is where things get complicated. Expanding the New Deal means that government spending is going to increase astronomically. And, that in and of itself is not too different from the New Deal. We've, kind of already talked about that. And it does seem like, if you're looking at these New Deal programs, that it does lead to a reduction in the poverty rate or the number of people in poverty during this time period. But at the same time, one of the other things that this kind of leads to is it comes around the same time that you see this, inflation in the money supply. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but one of the common explanations is that the government is basically injecting too much money into the economy through stimulus spending, and that's leading to inflation. The other thing, otherwise known as the Vietnam War, probably doesn't help matters either. But in the 1970s, you entered this period of almost hyperinflation, or actually not hyperinflation, stagflation, where the cost of goods is increasing, but the total economy, the GDP of the United States is shrinking. And by the way, collapsing economy and an inflating money supply, neither of those things is too good. But one of the culprits for this is the expansion of the welfare state during the 1960s. Maybe the argument is that you can either have the Cold War or expand the welfare state, but not both. Or maybe the argument is government mismanagement. A lot of conservatives in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s will periodically accuse Johnson and the New Deal programs of just spending money lavishly and inefficiently. And one of the reasons why many conservatives today emphasize fiscal responsibility so much is because of the perception that the federal government is inefficient at and really almost corrupt in how it spends money during the heyday of the Great Society, and to a certain extent, even during the Vietnam War. So I left point 5 blank in the Great Society, and it's probably the most important point of all. Johnson says he's going to do something about civil rights. So before we get to the civil rights movement in the 60s, we need to go back in time just a little bit and talk about where civil rights stand after World War II. So remember that you don't see that 13th or 14th Amendment moment during World War II, but you do see FDR take more than symbolic steps in desegregating parts of the federal government. And then Harry Truman desegregates the armed services shortly before the Korean War. Now, that being said, remember that even though the federal government has seen a pushback against Jim Crow, to a certain extent, we're getting back to the point that we were at before Woodrow Wilson is elected, and Wilson sort of unilaterally segregates parts of the federal government. And really, if you're looking at those governments that do actively discriminate based upon race, it's more something that happens at the state level. Again, the problem is the court case Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson says that no matter what the 14th Amendment says, it is okay for state governments to discriminate based upon race, as long as those state governments can make a passable argument that that discrimination isn't favoring one side or the other. So the idea is that you could have white schools and black schools, but so long as those schools were given equal accommodations, that's constitutional. And of course, the reality is that very often, equal accommodations were not provided. So the NAACP, which is the predominant civil rights organization that, remember, was organized at the turn of the century in the early 1900s, is pretty sure, at least lawyers for the NAACP, like Thurgood Marshall, pictured here, are pretty sure that if you get the right case, you can probably relitigate Plessy versus Ferguson and get that decision overturned. In other words, you can essentially get racial discrimination declared unconstitutional by using the language of the 14th Amendment. But you've got to find the right case, and you also have to get a Supreme Court that is willing to listen to you, and better yet, rule in your side's favor. And we're not there yet, until 1953. In 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower gets a chance to fill a Supreme Court vacancy. And he nominates a lawyer, but certainly not a judge, by the name of Earl Warren to be Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Earl Warren, like I said, was not a judge. Usually, if you are going to be a judge on the Supreme Court, most of the time, people look for judicial experience. And Earl Warren was not really a career judge. He was a politician. And by the way, this is one of those points where you realize that there's no sort of requirement really to be, well, even as far as the Constitution goes, to even have a law degree to sit on the Supreme Court. By the way, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, I don't have to go to law school if I want to be a judge. All I have to do is find somebody who will nominate me to be a Supreme Court justice. And I guess it's theoretically true, but the reality is that most appointees are judges at some point. But not Earl Warren. He's a politician. And if you're like me, that maybe makes your heart skip a beat. Like, it's kind of like, I don't know, electing somebody to be, the head of the U.S. Army, and that person says, well, I don't really know anything about the Army. I've never been in the Army, no experience with the Army, but I feel like I could do a good job. This seems to be the lead up for something catastrophic that happens. But while Earl Warren isn't exactly a legal scholar, what he is very good at is convincing people of things. And remember that in the Supreme Court, you've got 9 judges with 9 votes. And so if you're trying to make advances in the realm of civil rights, then having not only persuasive attorneys like Thurgood Marshall, but also persuasive judges might exactly be what you need. So, as probably almost all of you know, hopefully, is that in 1954, basically, Plessy versus Ferguson is relitigated, except it's a different name, and it has different facts, but it's the same basic principle. Instead of trains, we're talking about schools. Instead of Louisiana, we're talking about Kansas. And by the way, remember that Kansas is one of those territories that it fights for the Union during the Civil War. And yet Kansas, like some other parts of the Midwest, adopts Jim Crow laws after the end of Reconstruction. And Kansas had schools that were racially segregated, schools for white kids and schools for black kids. Thurgood Marshall, representing the NAACP, represents 6 black students who sued the Topeka, Kansas school district because of inadequate facilities. And this case makes it all the way up to the Supreme Court. Now, what's interesting is that we've kind of been here before, though. Remember that the Plessy versus Ferguson case was a case that was designed to essentially declare that Jim Crow laws were unconstitutional. And what happens is instead the Supreme Court validates Jim Crow laws. But we've come a long way since then. Marshall makes a very, very effective case. And additionally, Marshall has Earl Warren on his side. And Earl Warren basically decides that the court, one way or the other, is going to strike down Plessy versus Ferguson, and the ruling is going to be unanimous. The reason why that is significant is that if you have a case that's decided 5-4, one way or the other, that's kind of a weak ruling. That's sort of a sign that maybe you can get a similar case before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court might go the other way. It's a little wishy-washy. But when 9 out of 9 judges vote one way, that's a very strong signal that this is the way things are going to stay, unless at least 5 judges kick the bucket anytime soon, right? So Warren decides that he is going to ensure that this case is decided unanimously to strike down Jim Crow. That's exactly what happens. Brown versus Board of Education, at least the language of the opinion, you can kind of read this right here, that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. So in other words, being separate is inherently unequal. Now, it talks about schools, but remember that if racial discrimination in schools is illegal because of the 14th Amendment, well, that can apply to a whole host of other things. So basically what this does is that this decision guts the main constitutional argument in favor of Jim Crow laws. So then the question is, one, not only how are schools in Kansas going to integrate, but what about schools across the country? Because remember, the Supreme Court is supreme. What happens in the Supreme Court, not only affects the states that are involved in any given lawsuit, but they very often apply to states throughout the Union, as long as it doesn't, involve some specific area of state law, and this most definitely doesn't. So this gets into the politics of integration, and so remember that throughout the history of the United States, the Supreme Court is theoretically supreme, but in practice, its authority can only go as far as individuals are willing to back their decision. We saw this with the Indian Removal Act during the Jackson administration. The famous "John Marshall has made his ruling, now let's see him enforce it" point. I have no idea if that's how Jackson sounded. I don't think so. Anyway, so the question is, are states going to enforce it? And in 1954, you have what's called the Southern Manifesto, in which over 100 congressmen from the South pledged to oppose desegregation one way or the other. So in other words, you don't see resistance from the federal government, but you do see resistance at the state level, or at least from, congressmen, or Southern congressman. As you see that decision trickle down into lower courts, you have this drama in Little Rock, Arkansas, in which schools in Little Rock are supposed to desegregate and allow both white and black students to come to school. And a governor by the name of Orville Faubus, God, that name is unfortunate, Orville Faubus basically resists integration and calls out state National Guard troops to prevent, I kid you not, like 6-year-old black kids from coming to school. I mean, just think about that. A governor of a state calls out the state guard to prevent kids from coming to school. You can't make this stuff up, but that is what happens as integration starts. Now, Dwight D. Eisenhower is not a progressive person. He's not that person who's going out there trying to advance civil rights through any means possible. You can kind of call Eisenhower an incremental progressive in the realm of civil rights. He agrees with the idea of civil rights, but he doesn't believe that the country should take radical steps to get there. He's one of those individuals, and there are many of them, who believe that gradually over time, civil rights will kind of take care of itself. And so the best thing to do is just not to rock the boat. That's kind of Eisenhower's whole thing, right? Is that whether it's the Cold War, whether it's the American economy, whether it's in civil rights, Eisenhower is basically a don't rock the boat president. For those of you who have seen The Big Lebowski, and you basically shouldn't have, it's not really an appropriate movie for kids, but think of Eisenhower as that president who just abides. So that being said, though, Eisenhower really is committed to the idea of stability. And even though he's not super keen on Earl Warren's decision, and in fact kind of has regrets about Warren's appointment to the court, at the same time, it looks as if the real source of disorder is, governors like Orville Faubus, governors who are challenging the authority of the federal government, or at least the Supreme Court. But from Eisenhower's perspective, to challenge the federal Supreme Court is the equivalent of challenging him. So, yeah, Orville Faubus calls out the state guard to prevent kids from going to school, and Eisenhower responds by basically calling out the 101st Airborne Division, the division that jumped out of airplanes into France before the Battle of Normandy, and he calls on them to kind of stare down the state guard. So this is one of those events that really could have gotten messy. And if Faubus had successfully intimidated or cowed the federal government, well, then the legitimacy of the Supreme Court might have really been tarnished. Or other Southern governors might have realized or might have decided that they too could impede civil rights reform. Well, by sending in basically federal troops to escort the Little Rock Nine into campus, Eisenhower signals that the federal government will broker no opposition to the decree of the Supreme Court. So not only is Jim Crow struck down in theory through the Supreme Court, it's also struck down in practice by the strong response that Eisenhower makes in reaction to, Faubus's challenge. So not only do you see Jim Crow struck down, not only do you see the federal government suppress resistance at the state level, but in Congress you also see the passage of the first piece of civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. And we already briefly mentioned this during Johnson's early life, the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1957 doesn't do too terribly much, but it's a sign of where the country is going. It basically creates kind of a special branch of the Justice Department to investigate civil rights violations, in response to Brown versus Board of Education. So we can kind of get a sense of where the country is headed in civil rights. So Jim Crow laws have now been destroyed. This is like one of those great America moments, right? And it is, but that was no consolation to Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy in Mississippi who was brutally murdered by Ku Klux Klan members. And you might be wondering what his offense was. Well, apparently, Till flirted with a 21-year-old white woman. And so these Klan members followed Till and murdered him and basically left his body to rot in like a little pond. And so when Till is eventually found, his body is so like pulverized from the beatings that he suffered and just the rot that he's almost unrecognizable. Till's parents, though, decide to hold an open casket memorial service where you can see the full grotesque horror of what white supremacy looks like. This is what white supremacy does to people. And this funeral, this memorial service, got national attention. And by the way, this is the other reason why the TV is so game-changing. It's one thing to read about lynchings in a newspaper, but it's another thing to really see people emotionally react to these lynchings, to see sort of video evidence of what white supremacy looks like. And the fact is that that is being broadcast into the households of millions of Americans during the 1950s and 60s, but also beyond American households. It's also getting broadcast during the heyday of the Cold War. And we sort of mentioned this, that the United States sort of positions itself as being the defender of freedom and human rights abroad. Like the whole argument is that communism is authoritarian and it doesn't respect civil rights. And one of the common Soviet counterattacks is the fact, basically, the Soviet Union uses what is called, a response called whataboutism. Well, yes, we do this to our people, but what about blank? Well, the Soviet response is, what about blacks in the United States? What about Native Americans in the United States? And to be honest, it's a really good point. You can't sort of argue in favor of human rights and freedom and all that, but at the same time, have Jim Crow laws, which we just struck down, admittedly, but also have events like this. So the lynching of Emmett Till is one of those events that you can kind of think of it as almost like some of those events that we talked about in the build-up to the Civil War, like the raid on Harper's Ferry. One of those events that, or maybe even Bleeding Kansas. We're just talking about the life of one person here, but it's a 14-year-old boy. And this sort of forces people to maybe stop and take notice a little bit. And we can actually trace the, I think that probably the most accurate, or the argument that I personally buy, and you don't have to agree with this or not, but that the modern civil rights movement really begins with the death of Emmett Till and the display of his mutilated body for all to see. The death of Emmett Till demonstrated that even for black kids, the post-Jim Crow world was a very dangerous place. It also begs the question of whether we really can use the phrase post-Jim Crow, because there were actually a number of different areas where we see legalized segregation still. The fact that the Supreme Court has ruled that segregation is wrong doesn't mean that suddenly a switch has been flipped and all vestiges of Jim Crow were eliminated. And you actually get really egregious examples of this. You guys have probably heard about the Montgomery bus boycott and the name Rosa Parks. And it's one of those stories that gets told so often that we can take it for granted. It's like the Christmas story or something, right? We hear it so often that it loses its meaning because we kind of become numb to it. So Hopefully, just take what you know about this event and kind of set it to the side, because it is one of those stories that's told a lot for a reason. It's a pretty amazing one. So, in the city of Montgomery, Alabama, um, most of the individuals who were using public transportation, specifically buses, were black. In fact, 75% of the ridership of Montgomery buses were black patrons. So the thing is that, there's that whole thing in capitalism, right, where you need to know your market and know who you're selling to. And if that's the case, these buses should overwhelmingly cater to black Americans. But they don't. And that's not a capitalism thing. That's a white supremacy thing. Because in the city of Montgomery, basically the city's buses still maintain Jim Crow policies. The first 4 rows on the city buses were reserved for white passengers. And of course, if there were white people who couldn't find a seat, black patrons would be expected to remove themselves and allow white people to sit. Even though, again, it's mostly black people who use these buses. You don't have to be a math genius to realize that this is unsustainable. And the local NAACP chapter in Montgomery realized that if black writers would mobilize, well, then they might be able to put pressure on the city of Montgomery to basically overturn these racist policies. So what you need, though, for a boycott to work is you need a symbol to rally around. In the American Revolution, when the American colonies adopted boycotts against British goods, remember we had things like taxation without representation. We had a cause that got people angry. The depressing thing, though, is that for millions of Americans, white and black, it's almost like they've become numb to Jim Crow laws. Like this was just kind of something that you could take for granted. It's just the way life is. So you need to find some kind of egregious example. Enter Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, I know that there's like this little myth almost that says that, Rosa Parks was coming home from work. She was a seamstress and she was really tired. She didn't want to stand. And so she decides to sit down. The bus driver basically tells her to sit up. She does it because she's tired, and she becomes kind of like, her unwillingness to do that makes her a hero. And Rosa Parks, by the way, is a hero, but not exactly for those reasons. The thing is that because a lot of people think of Rosa Parks in that way, you lose. It's almost like you miss out on just the genius of everything that happens here. The NAACP has already decided to organize a boycott. They're just trying to figure out, what symbols to organize it around. So Rosa Parks is not just somebody who happened to be there on a certain day at a certain time. Rosa Parks was selected by the NAACP to actually become the symbol of their protest. In other words, she was one of a number of different black women who were sort of considered for this task. And it's not as if Rosa Parks was passive here either, because Rosa Parks did her homework. In 1943, she rode home on a bus, and apparently there was one bus driver by the name of James M. Blake that basically kicks her off his bus and leaves her by herself in the rain. Parks realizes that Blake might be easy to kind of manipulate a little bit, and so this is the background for that incident where Parks is arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus. Now, again, Parks is seated in the middle of the bus, and when white passengers arrive, Parks and everybody else on her row, they're ordered to give up their seats. 3 of her other black passengers do basically remove themselves, but Parks does not. And there is a very heated exchange between Parks and Blake, and Parks is actually arrested for this. And again, the refusal of Rosa Parks to give up her seat on the bus is the symbol that Dr. Martin Luther King uses to organize a bus boycott in the city of Montgomery, Alabama. So let's talk a little bit about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. At this point, hopefully, you guys already have so much background knowledge that there's not much that I can say that you don't already know. It's almost obvious to say that he is one of the great orators in world history, not just American history, but in all of world history. And even though you get the sound bites, the clips of the I Have a Dream speech, the fact is that that actually doesn't do the full thing justice. But I think that this is just me, but what stands out to me about Martin Luther King is not his almost flawless command of the English language and his ability to inspire others. It's not his intellectual brilliance. It's not his ability to be both passionate and yet compromising at the same time. All of these things simply make him an exceptional leader. But if you look at his early life, I think there's one incident that really stands out to me. King was born into a very religious family. His father was a pastor, but he was very close to his grandmother and his siblings. And King develops this deep-seated sense of responsibility for other people at an early age. King believes that he is morally responsible for his other siblings, including a younger sibling that went by the initials AD. And AD was, that younger sibling that liked to push the envelope. And he liked to sort of slide down the banister rail at King's family home. Well, again, King was unusually close to his grandmother, a woman by the name of Janine. And AD apparently at one point slides down the banister rail, and lo and behold, what happens is that he slides off the rail and into Janine. And she falls to the ground unconscious. King discovers her, and his first thought is that his grandmother has been killed by his younger brother. Now, at this point, if this were me, I would be super ticked off at younger sibling. But that's not King's first reaction. His reaction is not that his younger sibling is responsible. His reaction is that he, as the older brother, is responsible. And then what happens is that, and this is where the story gets a little dark, I suppose, is that he goes to the second story of the family home and jumps off the roof. He attempts suicide because of that feeling of responsibility. Now, eventually, he learns that Janine's okay, but then what happens is that later on in his life, at the age of 12, King sort of sneaks out of the house to avoid studying and goes to see a parade. Now, apparently what happens is that at the same time he is, sneaking out and, living the life and watching this parade, Janine actually dies. And King discovers this when he returns home. And that same feeling of responsibility kicks in. I have done something wrong. I have not been the best Martin Luther King I could be. And so therefore, God has taken this woman that I love away from me. And so King, once again, jumps off the roof of the family house and actually hurts himself a lot. Now, I guess the reason why I talk about this, and maybe you guys have heard that story, maybe you haven't, is the fact that from a very early age, Martin Luther King demonstrates a deep-seated sense of responsibility for other people. And it's a responsibility that he feels so strongly that he's willing to put his life on the line. And that's something that you see in Martin Luther King time and time again. He's obviously extremely well educated, gets a doctorate in divinity from, I think, Boston University, and then returns home to basically become a Baptist minister. Um, and he arrives in the city of Birmingham, Alabama, in I think around the year 1955. And with another civil rights leader, he helps plan the Montgomery city boycott in his mid-20s, by the way. I mean, it's like dude's just out of college. He's like 25, okay? And again, he helps mastermind this boycott. Um, and he actually becomes the spokesperson for that boycott, even though he's a newcomer, precisely because he doesn't have strong connections to the area. So if need be, he can kind of move on and not be directly affected. But this boycott goes on for 385 days. And during that process, King's family home is firebombed. But, you know, we talked about brinksmanship in the Cold War, but there's also this brinksmanship that occurs in the realm of civil rights, where King is standing against almost a century, really even more than a century, of, you know, institutionalized white supremacy in the Deep South. And throughout American history, what's happened is that black leaders who don't blink or don't swerve end up like, for example, the leaders of slave rebellions in the 1830s, like in 1840s, like Nat Turner. But this time what happens is that it's Southern state governments that blink. The United States District Court basically issues a ruling that forces businesses and buses in Montgomery to essentially desegregate. I think I said Birmingham earlier. I meant Montgomery, Alabama. But yeah, that's what happens. That King, because of that, because he stands up to Jim Crow laws or the legacy of Jim Crow laws, and wins, he becomes a national symbol overnight. And so he becomes the leader of an organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is an organization that is mostly, again, as the name would suggest, Southern, and is rooted in African American churches, especially Baptist and Methodist churches in the area. Now, there's another side to the story, though, because it's easy for us to think of, you know, King as the person who single-handedly, you know, sort of paves the trail for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that's not exactly what happens. That, in fact, you see protests from other groups and organizations like SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This group tends to be, as the name would suggest, college students, university students, and it tended to, like, let's say that it wasn't exclusively a Southern thing. And I guess what we can also say is that while the SCLC was a little bit more moderate, it wasn't really revolutionary in its outlook. It wasn't really pushing for radical change. In fact, King himself is influenced by Henry David Thoreau and Mahatma Gandhi and embraces civil disobedience. You'll eventually, well, we'll talk more about that in just a minute, but you'll also see, you know, you'll read a letter from a Birmingham jail, which kind of gives you an idea of King's own sort of spin on civil disobedience. But what we can say, though, is that while the SCLC is a little bit more moderate, SNCC eventually, later on, is not so moderate. Eventually becomes much more radical. And so you have those two very different approaches. And we'll talk a little bit more about Stokely Carmichael, who kind of gives you a very different perspective than Martin Luther King does. So those are the two big groups, and we think of the SCLC as being associated with boycotts in Montgomery and Birmingham, but SNCC is something that we might recognize based upon something a little bit closer to home. If you guys have ever heard of the sit-ins at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro. That was actually something that was a protest organized by SNCC, not by Martin Luther King. And the two groups kind of help one another, but there is some underlying tension in the visions that both the LCLC and SNCC have. And we'll see those tensions unfold a little bit more as time goes on. One approach that is shared, though, by both King and SNCC, at least for a time, is this emphasis on civil disobedience. And really, most of what King does from this point in his career until his assassination by James Earl Ray in 1968 is to take what happened between Rosa Parks and James Blake and basically apply that same formula to other instances of discrimination. Because one of the things that Rosa Parks did is she sort of forced James Blake to enforce laws that were unjust. And the idea of civil disobedience is that if a law is unjust and it has to be enforced, then by enforcing it at all, you demonstrate just how bad the law is. And so the idea is to force basically Southern government officials to defend these laws by enforcing them. And by doing so, to humiliate themselves in front of a national and increasingly televised audience. So Montgomery was sort of dealt with, but the city of Birmingham is a little bit different. King was not able to actually get the city of Birmingham to, desegregate its public accommodations. And so what King decides to do is to basically stage a series of protests during the Easter shopping season. And the idea is that it would basically inflict economic damage on the city of Birmingham by essentially making it very hard for people to buy stuff. Well, the city of Birmingham issues an injunction which prevents King and the SCLC from protesting. Now, of course, what happens is that King violates that injunction. Even though the city of Birmingham has basically said that they can't protest, King is going to protest anyway. And it's at that point when the one of the commissioners of Birmingham, the city of Birmingham, a guy by the name of Eugene Bull Connor, unleashes the hounds. And by the way, I mean that literally. Bull Connor is the police commissioner in Birmingham, and he is a tough law and order, traditional Southern politician, and he decides that he's going to make an example of King. And by the way, in some respects, he plays right into King's hands, because not only does Connor try to enforce these injunctions and enforce segregation in the city, he does so to a horrifying degree. You have instances of, dogs being deployed to basically tackle and bite and maul people, including young kids. You have the use of water cannon being directed at young kids who are out protesting. In other words, if King wanted somebody to overreact, well, even though Bull Connor was a horrible human being, he does exactly what King wants him to. And the nation is watching these protests unfold in Birmingham, and they're absolutely horrified. And again, remember that with the Cold War going on, it's not just Americans who are watching, it's the entire world. So, over the last few years, King has kind of been building his national profile. And after his successful Birmingham campaign, oh, by the way, I almost forgot. You should read Letter from a Birmingham Jail. It's a source that it's something that you have to source. But King is actually arrested in these protests and writes the sort of nationally, not syndicated, but yeah, this letter that sort of is reproduced in hundreds of national newspapers across the country, called A Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And it raises his profile even more, and he becomes kind of seen as America's civil rights leader, even though that's not quite the case. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So in 1963, it looks like the nation's attention is increasingly focused on civil rights. And taking advantage of this, King basically organizes a show of force by staging a march on Washington, D.C. in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and just kind of think about the optics of that. Staging a big rally in front of the president that ended slavery with the 13th Amendment.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. I have a dream. My four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Hey, people.